Greetings, everybody. I'm going to read the second part of chapter 4 of The Mystery of the Broken Mirror. This chapter is called The Making of the Mirror. Sorry, it's not called that. It's called The Breaking of the Mirror. I do apologise, The Breaking of the Mirror. Remember at the end of the last reading, I talked about shalom, peace, wholeness, when all the relationships for which God's created us are working properly, harmoniously, then we know that peace, that shalom, that peace that passes all understanding. We've been painting, however, what is, of course, a very ideal picture. If our diagram represents the mirror of God's life and being as it is reflected in creation, it doesn't, however, represent the reality of the world as we experience it and live in it. For we experience the mirror as a broken one in which the image of God is reflected, but only in a very distorted and patchy way. The breaking of the mirror is caused by the breaking down of those relationships. Just as the relationship with God was seen as a sort of umbilical cord through which life and grace flow, so the breakdown of that relationship cuts off the flow, with the result that the life of humanity and the life of the whole of creation suffers and is distanced from the divine purpose. This is what Christians mean when they talk about sin. Sins are not a catalogue of wrongdoings. They're rather the symptoms of the disease. Sin is a state of being, a condition in which we find ourselves. We can represent it on our diagram as a breakdown in the relationship between ourselves and God. Like that. So how does this state of being come about? If we take the easy way out and blame the situation on some external force of evil, as many Christians have done down the ages, then the poor devil, as we label him, acts as a very convenient scapegoat. But we're still left with the question of how God could have allowed evil to come into being. Is it not more realistic to regard evil as a divine absence, rather than as a malevolent anti-God? An illustration of this might be our experience of light. Light is a positive energy which radiates from a source. Darkness, on the other hand, only has negative existence. It's the absence of light. When light is introduced to a place, darkness no longer exists. It is driven away. In the same way, God's presence fills the universe, except where that presence is resisted and deliberately excluded. In such situations, evil can become a living presence through the life of people, activities and institutions which actively work against the presence of God. Why is it, however, that God allows this to happen? We discovered a clue at the end of the last chapter, which might help us to understand what might be happening here. I described God's creative act as a great risk, as a letting go. God gave the gift of freedom so that we creatures might freely respond in love to our Creator. That gift was, however, a dangerous risk, though perhaps a calculated risk on God's part. Our planet, and no doubt the whole universe, operates according to certain natural laws, which scientists are barely beginning to understand, but which seem to work without the need for God to intervene. For if God continually intervened, that freedom which was invested in creation to change and develop and evolve would be stifled. And creation would be a mere static snapshot of God's majesty instead of a changing, evolving drama. In particular, we humans have been given the choice of how we respond to God and how we relate to our fellow human beings and to the rest of the environment. Sin, therefore, is nothing less than a denial that our relationship with God is the determining factor in our lives. It's the denial, the suppression of the image of God in ourselves, and the setting up instead of a false image, a false conception of self, to replace God as the determining factor in our lives. So the inner relationship with ourselves, you could say, becomes an idolatrous one. We make an idol out of the self, a self made in our own image, and the relationship with God becomes broken. The breakdown in the relationship between our false selves and the source of our true being, in turn, affects other relationships. Rather than seeing ourselves as responsible and interdependent members of the human community, we regard ourselves as individuals with needs and with desires which we want to fulfill, even at the expense of the rights of others. Moreover, we project those desires onto larger groups to which we may belong. Groups of gender, race, class, or national identity. In this way, we delude ourselves that we are taking responsibility for one another when what we're actually doing is drawing circles within the human community which exclude in order to include. The self, whether it be an individual self or a group identity, is set over against others who are not self, or who are them rather than us. This innate sinfulness affects us in ways we're often too blind to realize. It was brought home to me powerfully but quite innocently by some members of a local community into which I moved some years ago. As I went around the community, getting to know a variety of people, I kept hearing the same refrain. You'll like it here. People are nice round here. That experience made a great impact on me. For a start, though the speakers usually mentioned they to refer to the fellow members of the community, I was aware that what they really meant was we. Furthermore, what on earth did that word nice mean? Nice. It's an empty word. It's used to mean something like whatever I consider to be acceptable. It only has a meaning when used as a yardstick to exclude others who do not measure up to my standards. Those who presumably are not nice. Not nice to know at all. I'm not trying to be superior here, because the same tendency is to be found in all of us. It seems that the concept of nice or acceptable or respectable is really defined by our own idea of ourselves. The false image of self which we carry with us and which we worship is used as a standard by which others are included in our circle or who stand condemned. The third relationship, that of ourselves to the wider creation, is also affected. For rather than seeing ourselves as an intrinsic part of creation, we set ourselves apart from it as some sort of superior special case. Once again, we've drawn a circle which includes human beings, but which excludes animals, plants, and the wider environment. It's interesting to note that we use the same reasons to justify our exploitation of the natural world that we once used to justify slavery or the subjugation of women and children, and which were there in a milder, less obvious form in the distinction between nice and not nice. We regard ourselves as belonging to a superior sort of life. Therefore, the rest of creation is intended, surely, for us to use as we will. The mainstream Christian tradition, by overemphasizing humanity as made in the image of God, has contributed to this growth of this attitude of dominance over creation, which has been such a feature, particularly of the Western world. We need to reroute the image of God in the whole of creation, with ourselves as part of it, rather than making humanity as some sort of special case. The domination view is well expressed by that famous testimony given by the North American chief Seattle in the year 1854. He famously said this: "One portion of the land is the same to him," he means the white man, "is the same to him as the next. For he is a stranger who comes in the night and takes from the land whatever he needs. The earth is not his brother, but his enemy. And when he has conquered it, he moves on. He leaves his father's graves behind, and he does not care. He kidnaps the earth from his children. He does not care. His father's graves and his children's birthright are forgotten. He treats his mother, the earth, and his brother, the sky, as things to be bought, plundered, sold like sheep or bright beads. His appetite will devour the earth and leave behind only a desert. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of the earth. If men spit upon the ground, they spit upon themselves. This we know. The earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. This we know. All things are connected like the blood which unites one family. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Interesting from our point of view is how Chief Seattle sees this breakdown in the relationship between humanity and the rest of creation to have come about as a result of idolatry. The belief that God can in some way be owned. One thing we know, he says, which the white man may someday discover. Our God is the same God. You may think now that you own him, as you wish to own our land, but you cannot. And he goes on to add a third commandment to the summary of the law, no doubt deliberately echoing it. Hold in your mind the memory of the land as it was when you take it, and with all your strength and with all your mind and with all your heart, preserve it for your children and love it as God loves us all. The command to love has been broken in all three relationships, with the result that the inner relationship of the human person with him or herself also becomes broken and confused. We lose self-respect and self-esteem, preferring to worship a false image of ourselves rather than love the person whom we really are with all our faults and weaknesses. The importance of self-love was emphasized by Jesus when he taught, love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. Instead, we've lost that inner peace and are prone to feel anxious, insecure, troubled. We've turned from God and have turned instead to idolatry, worshipping false images of ourselves and of human society. The mirror of creation becomes broken. The image of God is still there. It's still there to be seen, but in a distorted, fragmentary way. The cracks and the stains on the mirror loom large. One has to look hard and intently to see the reflection of the divine still present behind them.